Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about Zodiac. Quick little thing before I jump into the review. I've had some issues with YouTube as of late. I tried to upload my video review of the movie Anora, the latest Sean Baker movie, a movie that I very much enjoyed and was excited to talk about. And it's one of those videos where I uploaded it initially, YouTube checked it, so there were no copyright issues, and then a day later I get a copyright claim. And this happened 4 times. I had to re-edit my video, upload it 4 times, and then a day later passes, and it keeps getting taken down. And you know what? I just said, fuck it. I'll just have to delete the video altogether. I've never had this issue before with any of my other reviews. It's really quite frustrating. I'm not sure if this is because it's a newer movie or whatever, but unfortunately, that video will no longer be seen. But if for anyone who wants to hear my thoughts, I'll give it on that movie. I'll just be real brief. It's great. Anora is a really great and entertaining movie that catches you by surprise and is emotionally stirring and very, very funny. That's my review. So with all that being said, hopefully I don't have any issues with another amazing movie here, but amazing for totally different reasons. Yesterday, I just randomly got in the mood for a good, gripping crime thriller film, and I'm like, you know what? I want to watch Zodiac, because I had only seen this movie one time prior to my latest rewatch. And I'm a big David Fincher fan. I think most cinephiles are big David Fincher fans. And watching it the second time, I loved it even more. I can already tell this is going to be one of those movies where I'm just going to get a hankering to rewatch it every couple of years. And whenever I do rewatch it, I'm going to love it even more. I'm going to get more out of it. I'm going to see new things. I'm going to appreciate different elements of it. It's just going to be one of those movies that keeps on giving. I can already tell, because it's a film that is packed with so many amazing sequences, so many amazing details to those sequences, and to the filmmaking, and to the performances, and the storytelling, and just all of the above. It's a movie that is so powerful, and so thrilling, and so disturbing, and in many elements actually quite funny. That was one of the things I picked up on my latest rewatch, is there's a lot of humor to Zodiac. And it's one of those movies where I am surprised to hear that some people find boring. I mean, obviously people can have their opinions, but to me, this movie is anything but boring. It is riveting from beginning to end. But before I go off on a tangent, I'll just give a brief synopsis of what this film is about. I mean, if the title didn't give it away already, the movie's about the real-life Zodiac killer that wreaked havoc in the San Francisco Bay Area starting in 1969. In this movie, there's long periods of time that this movie takes place in. It starts in 1969, leads all the way down to 1978, and there's an epilogue that takes place in 1991. And because this movie covers so much time and so much detail, it's a long movie, but still somehow under 3 hours, which this is one of those movies that could have been easily like a 3-hour movie, which I would have been fine with. But it's a movie that is around 2 hours and 40 minutes. The director's cut is 2 hours and 45 minutes. And like I said, from beginning to end, from the opening sequence alone, where we get that incredibly haunting, we get that song playing in the background, about people being heartless, which is very, perfectly setting the tone for this movie. How can people be so heartless? That camera shot leaning out the car window, driving down the suburban neighborhood, picking up the dude, and these 2 kids go down to that park area, and just right when that first killing happens, where we get Donovan's hurdy-gurdy man playing in the background, it's just like, all right, buckle up, because this movie is not going to pull any punches. There's so much to go over with this movie. It's almost overwhelming. I'll try to pace myself here, but one of the things that needs to be talked about when discussing this movie is the attention to detail. If there was any movie that was tailor-made for David Fincher's particular brand of filmmaking, it's this movie right here. And the screenplay writer of the film, James Vanderbilt, he said his first choice was David Fincher because of Seven, kind of the serial killer movie. And so he wanted to get David Fincher, but he didn't think he would. And David Fincher, who lived around the area at the time of the Zodiac killings, he said he was around in the 2nd or 3rd grade, actually has vivid memories of his parents telling him to be careful when he's on the school bus, because the Zodiac made a particular threat about shooting out buses and picking off kids one by one and all this terrible, terrible stuff. So he talked about it. So it's a movie that's very personal to David Fincher. And you can tell that he really cared about being as honest and as authentic as possible. Watching the behind the scenes of this movie was really, really interesting because he even wanted to get like the victim's clothing down to the minute details, the color of it, the patterns of it. They painstakingly, the wardrobe department recreated the victim's clothes as accurately as possible, given the information that they had. And that's one of the reasons why the movie uses CGI blood. I don't know how common knowledge that is, but one of the reasons the movie doesn't use practical blood effects is because it took so long to create the wardrobe that they didn't want to ruin it with fake blood, clean it up, and then it would just take way, way too long. And watching the movie, I had no idea that there was any CGI in the film at all. It was so well done, and obviously it's very little CGI, but it just goes to show you that you can use CGI effectively. This is one of the greatest examples of that. So the movie is incredibly accurate to both the book that it was heavily inspired by, the book written by Robert Graysmith, who was played by Jake Gyllenhaal in the movie, the political cartoonist who kind of made it his life's mission to find out who the Zodiac killer was after, the case was left open, but, wasn't really taking priority anymore. It became his obsession. And so the movie really centers around three core characters. There's Robert Graysmith played, by the way, all the performances across the board are just so fantastic and consistent with the tone of the movie. It's just really, really brilliant. So it's Robert Graysmith, the political cartoonist at the Chronicle, played by Jake Gyllenhaal. There's, of course, Robert Downey Jr., Paul Avery, who is a big factor in this story. One of the journalists who wrote about the Zodiac, and the Zodiac made a personal threat against him, and you see how that really affects his life throughout this movie in a way that's just like really haunting.
Are you okay?
No. Thank you for asking.
And Robert Downey Jr. is hilarious in this movie, too. The movie has a lot of moments of bits of humor. The humor never goes overboard, but there's surprisingly a good amount of dry humor in this movie that I really appreciated on this rewatch that I thought was a lot of fun.
Does it ever bother you that people call you Shorty?
Does it bother you that people call you a retard?
Nobody calls me that.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the chief investigator who took up the Zodiac killings, played by Mark Ruffalo, investigator Dave Toschi, who was the inspiration for both Dirty Harry and Bullet. They're kind of the three core characters in this movie. The movie shows how this case and this murder pretty much took over a large period of their lives, and how they're dealing with the paranoia, how they're dealing with wanting to solve this crime because they just want the terror to be over. You feel the dread and the tension throughout this entire movie, and how this very bizarre series of killings just took over the nation in a way that just had never been seen before. And the first killings started in 1969, and that was the same year that the Manson killings happened at Roman Polanski's house with the murder of Sharon Tate. And that was one of the biggest turning points in our American history, where we went from the peace-loving 60s to the very cynical, dirty, gritty 70s. And that affected cinema very, very greatly as well. Once we start getting into the late 60s, early 70s of cinema, you see a big turning point with movies being much darker, way more nihilistic, way more cynical, with movies like Dirty Harry, which gets a specific mention in this movie because Dirty Harry was heavily inspired by the Zodiac murders. Movies like the French Connection is another one, and you also feel the influence that David Fincher is taking from those movies and he's putting into this movie. But the biggest influence that this movie takes from is clearly All the President's Men, which is a movie that I have seen before, actually. I watched it for the first time either last year or in 2023. Thought it was a very well-made movie. I enjoyed it, but it's not the most riveting movie in the world, because the Watergate scandal, in comparison to most scandals nowadays, it just doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But it was a huge deal at the time. David Fincher has named that movie in particular as being one of his 26, oddly specific number, favorite movies of all time, and you can tell that so much of that movie is in this movie as well, as kind of a loving homage, because this movie is really about the investigation that Robert Graysmith takes up in the latter half of this movie, getting all of the specific details and giving the audience all of the details too. I mean, this is a movie that is like, it leaves me feeling exhausted in a very good way. Like, I feel like by the end of this movie, I almost feel like Robert Graysmith, where I'm just like, I'm riveted by what's happening. I want to get to the bottom of it, but also like it's leaving me drained emotionally. And you see how the case really affects him and all of the characters in this movie. There are so many amazing specific sequences in this film too. The one that gets mentioned the most often is the basement sequence, which is for good reason. It is a scene that I'm sure is studied in film schools, and if not, that's crazy to me. It's a masterclass scene in building suspense and tension. Of course, it's the scene where Robert Graysmith is on the trail of the Zodiac. He's getting a lot of information. He tracks down this guy, and he believes that the person who drew these posters was the person that wrote the letters, which means it was a Zodiac killer. And then he ends up talking to the guy, and the guy's like, actually, I'm the one who draws the posters. And you're like, oh my God.
Mr. Graysmith, I do the posters myself. It's my handwriting.
Please get out of there, Jake Gyllenhaal. Please get out of there. And to make the scene even more creepy, why don't you come down with me in the basement? And it's like, oh God, oh my God. It is nail-biting suspense. The way that scene plays out is so well made. But for my money, it is not the scariest scene in this movie. Everybody says it's the scariest scene in this movie. How can anybody say that that's the scariest scene in the movie when Robert Graysmith got out of there alive and unscathed mostly? You compare that to the lake murder sequence in the daytime, which I think is one of the most genuinely unnerving sequences in any movie ever. Like, it creeps me out to the bone and like deeply disturbs me, as it should. I mean, that's what the scene is meant to invoke. And it's the way the scene plays out, the way it's super accurate to the actual sequence that happened in reality. David Fincher talked to the person who survived that attack, who David Fincher said he doesn't seem to have like any PTSD about it at all. It's like, it's crazy that guy is like, I'm glad that he was mostly left untraumatized, I guess. I mean, who knows what's going on internally, but he cooperated with the movie. He helped create all the little details to the sequence. That scene is one that really, really sticks with you. And throughout the whole movie, it's just like, while our characters are trying to find out who's this guy, what's going on, the whole time I'm watching, I'm like, how could a human being just do that? You know what I mean? Like, these murders that took place in a time where that was not a common thing, these murders that took place, like, what was the reason other than just like blatant attention and fame seeking? But like, to do that just for that, I mean, it really, like, it leaves me like sick to my stomach. And the movie moves at such a pace, even when there isn't like murder sequences happening. The movie's moving at such a pace with our characters frantically trying to get all the information, trying to solve this case, that question more or less it doesn't really get answered as to, well, what's the motivation behind it? There's a great sequence where Robert Graysmith goes to see Paul Avery after many years. Paul Avery's looking like a ghost. His hair's gray. He's not taking care of himself. He's living on a boathouse. And, he talks about, he's like, the Zodiac killed like 5 people. He's like, there are more people that die on the expressway than that asshole ever killed. It's like, let's just let it go. And our characters just can't. They can't let it go. And that's one of the main themes of this movie, is the theme of like obsession and wanting to try to find the truth and wanting to get justice. And sometimes we live in the world where that doesn't happen. The first time I watched this movie, I was pretty familiar with the Zodiac killings, and I was familiar with the fact that they were unsolved. And I was like, how is this movie going to end in a satisfactory way that like completes the story? And oh man, does it ever. So both the book that Robert Graysmith wrote and the movie, of course, have one main suspect in the Zodiac killings, and that is a man named Arthur Lee Allen, played by John Carroll Lynch, who's one of those great character actors you see in a ton of different stuff. He's very, very good in this movie. And the amount of like evidence that they get that's just like, how could it not be this guy? And he gets off because like some of the DNA doesn't match and the handwriting wasn't the same. And then we find out that the guy who examined the handwriting was an alcoholic. And the movie goes over painstaking details of how hard it is to conduct an investigation like this, especially during the time, due to the lack of technological advances that we have now that they clearly didn't have back then, and how hard it is for cops to get a warrant, how hard it is for cops to try to keep the narrative down to a minimum so you don't create a panic. Well, that definitely didn't really work out. And then when rumors start happening and people start falsely confessing to the Zodiac, and it just creates a mess, and it's like you're watching the movie, you're like, oh god, they're never going to catch this fucking guy. But the way the movie ends, where Robert Graysmith, he gets all the information he can for his book, and then he goes to the hardware store, and it's just a look. He looks at him, he's like, can I help you? And he just looks at him, and he's like, no. And the way Fincher's able to convey that scene with little to no dialogue and not having to explain to the audience, it's like, our character knows he's the Zodiac, that character knows that he is, and he knows who Robert Graysmith is, because Robert Graysmith got a lot of attention in the local area for doing investigations, and he was getting anonymous phone calls at his house, and it's such a powerful scene. And then when you get to the ending of this movie, the epilogue, where Doyle McPoyle, who survived the Zodiac killing,
Just move past it, all right?
you will call her! I'm kidding, of course. It's the same character in the beginning of this movie, played by the different actor who's in Always Sunny, who I absolutely love. And we don't know who this character is the first time you watch it. And we're like, okay, what is this scene? 1991, at an airport, we see that the Zodiac book has been out and it's a big success. An investigator, talks to this guy. We don't know who he is. He lays out pictures of Zodiac suspects. And the victim picks the one that is Arthur Lee Allen, and ends with that haunting line. He's like, no, that's the man who shot me.
Last time I saw this face was July 4th, 1969. I am very sure that's the man who shot me.
It was one of those moments where the first time I saw it, I was like, dude, holy shit. This is one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. It is a masterpiece, Zodiac, in like every single way. Technically, it's perfect. The way it's directed, the way it's edited, the way it's shot, the wardrobe design, the set design, the way the movie legitimately feels like it's taking place in the late 60s and in early to late 70s. The performances are all just incredibly solid, and they really drive the momentum of the movie, because you sympathize with these characters. You're like a detective yourself watching this movie. You're like, I want to work with these characters. I want to help these guys out. I want to end the misery and the obsession. I have no flaws with this movie. I guess the only flaw I have is, like, this is the second time I've watched it, and I'm drained. I love this movie, but it's not one of those movies that I can watch every year, like I see so many people talk about. But it is going to be one of those movies where it's like every couple of years, maybe like 2 or 3 years, I'm going to be like, I got to watch Zodiac again. Because as a film lover, I just get so much out of this movie. And it is probably my favorite David Fincher film. I think it's probably his most perfect. I mean, it's right up there with, of course, Fight Club and The Social Network as well. I really love The Social Network. I would love to talk about that movie in the future. But he's just such a great and consistent filmmaker, and I think this is probably ranks as being his finest film. But that's just my opinion. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. What are your favorite David Fincher movies? What are your thoughts on the Zodiac? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Mention it in the comments below. And as always, thank you guys for watching.